Help support Name Explained by leaving a like and a comment, sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel. A pond tends to be a relatively small enclosed body of water. In fact, their etymology comes from their enclosedness, as pond is simply a form of the word pound, with a pound being a type of enclosed place, like a dog pound for example. Ponds are seen as being very quaint and cute. If they were any larger, there would be a lake, and if they flow to somewhere else, there'll be a river. In my mind, ponds are always very picturesque. Like, I imagine a little pond in the middle of a small rural village with a couple of ducks bobbing around in it, and even maybe a frog or something. Very cottagecore or whatever people say, I have no idea. What doesn't come to mind for me when I think of ponds is the second largest ocean on our planet, the Atlantic Ocean. Only beaten by the Pacific, this huge ocean spans 41 million square miles and covers around 25% of the Earth's entire surface. Its raging waves had led to the demise of many people and ships. It's where hurricanes are formed. And of course, these waters are named after the mythical titan of Atlas himself. The Atlantic Ocean is far removed from my quaint little concept of a pond, so we really shouldn't call it one. But here's the thing, as I'm sure many of you already know, this mighty ocean gets referred to as a pond an awful lot of the time. Well, maybe I should say the North Atlantic does anyway. As this ocean is so huge, it sometimes gets split into two small oceans of the North and South Atlantic, and the term of pond gets applied more often than not to just the North. Just thought I would mention that now, as if I didn't, someone in the comments would have. Anyway, the pond isn't the only alternative name this ocean has gone under. While Atlantic Ocean, or some ancient form of that name, is the oldest known name we have for it, being used by the Greeks thousands of years ago, it has also been known as the Ethiopian Sea and the Great Western Ocean. But of all of its alternative names, the pond seems to be the most popular. However, not everyone and anyone refers to the Atlantic as the pond. There's a chance you may have never used or heard this term before in your life, and that's because referring to the Atlantic as the pond is seemingly only done by two groups of people, that being people from the USA and people from the UK. However, I'm curious to know if people from Canada and Ireland use these terms too. Those two countries are very close geographically, politically, and linguistically to the UK and USA, so there's a chance you guys might use them too. Let me know if you do or not down below. Thanks. But yeah, pond, or more often the pond, is a cute little nickname people from these nations use for the 3,000 miles plus of rough waters that separate their two nations. As a British person myself, this means I use the term pond too, and what's interesting is that despite the fact the Atlantic gets referred to as the pond, we never really directly call it the pond. That sounds weird, I know, but hear me out. Calling the Atlantic the pond is only done in specific phrases and under certain circumstances. You wouldn't just call it the pond willy-nilly. Like if a marine biologist saw a blue whale in the Atlantic, they wouldn't say, "Oh look, there's a blue whale in the pond," as that's just a tad weird. Referring to the Atlantic as the pond is done in phrases like "on the other side of the pond" or "across the pond," which are used in place of actually saying the USA or the UK, more often when we are highlighting a certain event or custom from either nation. For example, someone from the USA might say, "Well, across the pond, they don't really celebrate Thanksgiving." Apologies for my accent there, but I had to give it a go. Or someone from the UK might say, "On the other side of the pond, they don't really celebrate bonfire night." I mean, I already have a British accent. Why am I putting one on? I have no idea. But so on, you get the idea. In phrases like these, most people know that across the pond means either the UK or USA, and that the pond in question is the Atlantic Ocean. This means that when we call the Atlantic the pond, it is more often than not as part of a larger term to refer to either the UK or USA. It's a tad strange, I know, but we make it work. Referring to the Atlantic Ocean as the pond is something in linguistic terms called meiosis, completely different to the cell division kind of meiosis for those curious. Meiosis in language is when we purposefully understate something. For example, it would be like someone referring to a huge oak tree as a little twig, or say referring to someone like Hitler as a bit of a bad egg. We use meiosis in language for a variety of reasons. It can be used to undermine someone or something, like I just did with my Hitler example, but it can also be used to help people talk about a really difficult subject. A great example of this is with the Troubles in Ireland. Referring to this time in Irish history as just the Troubles is something of an understatement, but it made discussing these issues somewhat more palatable, especially for people going through them at the time. Though perhaps the main reason we use meiosis in language is simply because it can be funny. There's a lot of humour to be derived from understating things, like saying to someone, "I'm having a little bit of an issue with my car," and then showing them that car and the entire thing is on fire. That's just quite funny in a weird way. One of the main ways that we create jokes is by twisting our expectations, and meiosis does that incredibly well. Going back to using the word pond for the Atlantic an example, it is kind of funny that we call this huge ocean a pond. And it's kind of okay for the UK and the USA to have a little joke about the huge amount of water between them. This is because for some time the UK and the USA have had a pretty close relationship, a very special relationship some might say. This wasn't always quite the case however. The nation that became the United States of America had its roots in British colonies on the continent. As these colonies grew, for a variety of reasons, they didn't want to be ruled by the British, but instead wanted to be their own independent nation. A series of states that were united in America or something. This all kicked off with their war for independence in 1776 against the British. This war would come to an end in 1783 when the British accepted the USA's independence from them. You would think this would leave the UK and USA on bad terms for quite some time, but that wasn't the case at all. Diplomatic relations between the two nations started just 2 years later in 1785. I mean, these relations broke down again in the follow-up War of 1812, but by 1815 things were good between the two nations again. Since then, these two nations have grown closer, and that relationship really solidified during the First and Second World War when the UK and USA were very close allies. On the website for the US Embassy in London, they talk about this relationship by saying that the United States has no closer ally than the United Kingdom. Basically, thanks to their shared history, language, and other factors, the UK and USA are political BFFs, which is really cute, I suppose. But despite how close these two nations are, they're not the kind of friends who live down the street from one another. The UK and USA's relationship is one that is a tad more long distance, with the main physical hurdle between the two being the Atlantic Ocean, of course. This is why this ocean has become referred to as the pond. It is an ironic joke of sorts. The UK and USA are so close that they aren't going to let a huge ocean get in the way of their relationship. In fact, they're so tight that the Atlantic Ocean is little more than a tiny pond to them and their friendship. This term symbolizes the closeness between the nations and how even something as huge as the Atlantic Ocean isn't going to get in their way. And of course, recent innovations in technology has made this ocean easier to get across, whether that be it being physically easier to get from one side to the other thanks to better boats and airplanes, or just communication between people from either side being easier. This whole video was inspired by the fact that I host a podcast with an American, and Paul and myself are always amazed that we are able to do this, especially when we were talking about ancient civilizations like Rome on the show, who simply weren't able to just jump on an online call. This might make you think that this term of the pond is a relatively new one that not only symbolizes the closeness in the UK and USA's relationship, but one that also reflects how easy communication and travel between the two nations has become. It's more like traveling across a little pond these days than a huge ocean. That isn't the case at all, however. We were calling the Atlantic the pond way before Zoom calls and airplanes, and even before the USA was even its own nation. The earliest reference we have to oceans being called a pond dates back to 1612. This was in a religious text from Britain written by Bishop Joseph Hall. In this text, he referred to the world's collective oceans as the Great Pond, which makes sense as all these oceans do connect up with one another, I suppose. This means that the idea of calling an ocean a pond dates back to over 400 years ago. The earliest recorded evidence we might have of the Atlantic specifically being referred to as a pond would come around 30 years later in 1642, though some sources point to it coming from 1640, and while this is the oldest written evidence we have of the matter, it could have been used in speech way earlier and we just don't have evidence for it. Anyway, this written record comes from a pamphlet which recorded a conversation between two of King Charles I's courtiers, Lord John Finch and Sir Francis Windbank. It reads, "Well met, my lord. It seems you have taken flight over the great pond. Pray, what news in England?" For context of just how long ago this was, the UK's first settlement in the Americas was founded in 1607, so just a few decades before this quote, and the famous Mayflower sailed in 1620, around 20 years before this quote. So people started referring to the Atlantic as the pond in regards to the UK and the USA fairly quickly. There is an issue with all this, however. We aren't entirely sure if the pond they were referring to is the Atlantic or not. We have no evidence that either of these men ever travelled to the USA, so despite this being seen by so many as an early reference to the Atlantic as the pond, we aren't really too sure. More concrete evidence of the Atlantic being called the pond comes in 1686, so still some time ago but a little more recent. This was written by John Dunton in one of his letters from New England. It reads, "Tomorrow, if a gale presents, we sail on for a new world, or so they call America. At my first arrival, I'll send an account of the wonders I meet on the great herring pond." And you probably noticed that he didn't call it just the pond, but called it the great herring pond. This is a reference to the kind of fish, the herring, which yes are found in the Atlantic. Why he called it this specifically, I have no idea. Dude must just have loved herring or something. Whatever the case, we can confidently see here that the Atlantic was being called a pond, especially in relation to the UK and USA. It would take some time for it to get shortened to just the pond, as well as some time for it to be adopted stateside. If you didn't notice, all these previous examples are being used in the UK to refer to the USA. In 1780, a pro-British newspaper in New York was recorded as saying "across the pond," and I shan't read out the full quote because out of context it sounds rather inappropriate and might get this video demonetized, but there'll be a link down below so you can read it for yourself. What this all shows us, however, is that the Atlantic has been referred to as a pond for a rather long time, and it's a term that reflects just how close the UK and USA truly are to one another. Now, if we could all just agree on what we should call football, that would be swell. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and once again, thank you all so much.